What is going on in American politics? I mean, does democracy even exist? Is anything more than a mirage? Is it more than an illusion?
If you've ever watched this channel and enjoyed the content, or if you're enjoying this episode, could I ask for a small favor? Please hit the subscribe button. Your subscription helps this channel more than I can explain right now, and also makes you an integral part of our success. I promise to return the favor by making the show increasingly better. We're on this journey together, and I'm willing to make that promise to you if you hit the subscribe button.
Wait a second.
Do we have a deal?
Political polarization in the U.S. has reached alarming heights, creating a chasm so wide that it risks tearing the nation apart. The divide between liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, is not just a matter of opinion. It's becoming a fracture in the very fabric of our democracy. Since the early 2000s, this polarization has escalated into a frightening phenomenon. Unfavorable opinions of the opposing parties have skyrocketed, reaching unprecedented levels. This is not just a political trend. It's a warning sign of a populace increasingly willing to view their fellow citizens as enemies. Many now see polarization as a dire threat to democracy. Yet fixating solely on this issue could blind us to even darker forces at play: disinformation, economic inequality, and institutional decay that collectively endanger our democratic integrity. Ignoring these existential threats risks shaking the foundations of our democratic processes and eroding public trust to perilous levels. Is the surge of political polarization in the U.S. a harbinger of democracy's demise? Are we witnessing a gradual yet catastrophic erosion of the essential checks and balances our democracy desperately needs to survive?
The real issue is actually the subtle convergence of the two parties that's taking place behind the scenes. If you look at what's happening in terms of the Democratic and Republican parties, to the extent they're able to successfully keep any third party out, it's sort of evidence, actually, that they are in fact one party. And I think that's what we really need to worry about. Any dissonance or disagreement or even polarization, as you say, is actually the hallmark of a healthy democracy, of healthy debate. But what we're really experiencing now in the United States and what we're really witnessing is the convergence of these parties insofar as they have one real objective goal. And that goal, in my opinion, is the rise of a plutocracy, or maybe the rise of a plutocracy is a sort of subsect of oligarchy. We see the people out in front who are we can call them actors, if you will. If we think of it in terms of political theater, these are the front men, or in the case of Kamala Harris, the front woman. But the fact is that there's a power behind the throne, and that power never really changes. And those interests are very much so the interests of the party of wealth. And it's really become, we can say, even the party of decadence. Their interests are going to be protected above all else. And aside from that, there is foreign interests involved as well. We can say particularly one foreign interest that we see has great sway and great influence over American politics and its decisions. And this is borne out by the facts. It's borne out by statistics, really, because we see that in the United States in 1965, for example, the average CEO at a company earned about 20 times what a worker did, but by 2018 that had ballooned to 278 to 1. So an extraordinary wealth gap has been created, and this chasm between the workers in the United States, the average person who's voting, and in this belief that they have this contention between a liberal or a conservative or a Democrat and Republican, it's a distraction, it's a diversion actually from the fact that neither party really has very different objectives, policy objectives or goals. And we see that in this current election, perhaps more than any other election, where we see a blurring of the lines on what used to be hard and fast policy issues, where prominent Democrats convert to the Republican Party and vice versa. We see prominent Republicans at all levels seeming to support the Democratic Party. And it's not entirely clear what exactly separates the parties any longer. And the reason for that is because we see the emergence again of this sort of underlying protected class, this elite group who is really calling the shots. And the erosion of democracy, would be difficult to argue against that when you see what happened with Kamala Harris, for example, where there was not a primary, yet she's the leading candidate for the Democratic Party. And there's enough evidence out there, and there's enough outcry about sort of the dismissal of President Joe Biden, who rarely appears to be in charge of the country. If we look at what's being said by some, that he sort of, unwillingly relinquished his position as the candidate for the Democratic Party, it's a remarkable thing, because that alone, that sequence of events, that you have the rise of a party candidate without primaries, which undermines the electoral system, and then you have a sitting president sort of pushed aside. But even if he wasn't pushed aside, it's hard to argue that he wasn't already severely impaired from a cognitive perspective. Even at the time of his inauguration, he was having trouble with his speech. He was having trouble forming lucid thoughts. So there is a group of elites behind that who put him forward as the public face of that party. But I think it is probably more accurate for the American public to think of these candidates not so much as opposing one another or as having this sort of detrimental polarization, as it were, but rather that this polarization and this bipartisan fighting is really more of a distraction. It's more of a diversion from what's really taking place, which is a party, a uniparty, we can say, which is in power and which never really leaves. That's the party of wealth. That's the party of decadence, which is always in place. And then we see the rise of the ultra-wealthy oligarchs, many times technocrat oligarchs that we've talked about in other episodes. We see Bill Gates, for example, donating $50 million to the Harris campaign. And Elon Musk, of course, is running this lottery-style giveaway with giving $1 million away daily to support his sort of frontman and entering the political scene from the realm of business. And this convergence really of the support of government for the wealthy class, for the elite class, is unashamed. And these large monetary contributions are out in the open. And the closer that oligarchy comes to the government, the more difficult it becomes to distinguish them, in fact, and to a point where they become indistinguishable from leading government players. Now we see, of course, Elon Musk is being presented as the co-founder of this, the Office of Government Efficiency. How does a civilian, a business person, become a co-founder of a government office? To put somebody in charge who already has accumulated so much of the nation's wealth and put him in a position where he can accumulate even more of the nation's wealth really should be cause for concern. There should be huge question marks on that. So I think what we really see here as the threat to democracy is the erosion of any independent branch like the judiciary, which is fading into the shadows because it is becoming really a conduit to support corporate interests and special interests from foreign entities. And then what you have is you have a trifecta of control, not only at the highest levels of the federal government, even at the lower levels of administration in the country, where there is greater and greater influence of the elites, to the extent that you begin to see the erosion of democratic ideals, you begin to see the erosion of the input of the people, and you begin to see insiders and elites who are operating behind closed doors. It's very difficult to understand what exactly they're doing and how they make decisions and determinations. It's out of public view, and the public is certainly not participating in that process. So you really see it actually from the time we see the promotion of Kamala Harris to the leading candidate for the Democratic Party, sans the primaries, and we see this was already a continuation of having a president in place who was impaired cognitively, and then we see the emergence, of course, of the leading Republican candidate, who there's no question the great wealth and the great control and the great agenda, really, of this party of wealth, this party of decadence, which is going to be protected at all costs.
In today's suffocating grip of post-truth politics, where the terms post-factual or post-reality lurk like shadows, a pervasive sense of public anxiety weighs heavily upon us. A chasm divides understanding, blurring the lines between what is true and false, illuminating how effortlessly we can succumb to sinister narratives and corrosive misinformation, especially in this treacherous digital age. This insidious issue permeates numerous media platforms, from the deceptive realms of social media to the echoing void of podcasts. Information is twisted and weaponized to distort public perception and perpetuate confusion. The landscape is rife with disinformation and fake news, a dark echo powered by massive computing power of historical propaganda that has ensnared societies in its clutches time and again. Trust in institutions, political parties, and the media that once guided us has crumbled, intensifying the descent into post-truth politics. In a world where individuals feel engulfed by doubt and anxiety, the struggle to verify facts becomes futile. Increasingly, they turn to poisonous sources, craving a distorted reflection of reality. This pervasive distrust breeds treacherous political divides, casting a chill over our democracy, which now teeters on the brink of instability. In this grim reality, the truth is shattered, giving rise to chaos and despair. What is the antidote, and where do we go from here as a society?
There's a dismantling of the very notion of archive, certainly a valid archive, an archival memory. It's been replaced really with a very short-term memory and the erosion of memory, in fact. And the corrosive effects of social media and the way social media has been designed to create this endless scrolling is having a horrible impact on the intellect, certainly on young minds that are forming. Usually up until the early 20s, you have kids who are on this thing for years while their mind is developing their intellect. And the very notion of being able to call to mind something that is in archive, validly in archive, is being destroyed. So truth is becoming increasingly relative because truth becomes really your truth or my truth or the truth of the moment. Our memory is becoming something like 4 or 5 seconds. And if you look at the effects of something like X, for example, the way it's been created, these algorithms, to silo and to show the viewer what they want to see, what reaffirms their own biases, this sort of confirmation bias, is leading to a hypervelocity of information. It's like drinking from a fire hose, and the result is that the mind was never really meant to ascertain and to process and to store information at that velocity, and certainly not with information coming at it that is highly curated by a supercomputer that's running an algorithm that knows exactly what to show you instead of a diversity of ideas or to show you things which can be factually verified. The viewer is simply succumbing to a flood of knowledge and information. And yet we live in a time where people hunger and thirst for knowledge. They hunger and thirst for truth. Their mind is created really in the image and likeness of God, to seek the truth. That's a natural human instinct. But instead, now what is happening is that the mind and the intellect is being formed very differently. It's being formed in a way that is more easily manipulated, enslaved really to these technologies. And who would have thought that the human mind could be controlled with something other than chemical substance? Certainly, pharmaceutical companies and drug dealers have known for a long time that a human being who's addicted to pharmacological substance could be controlled. But who would have thought 20 or 30 or 50 years ago that technology would reach a point where it too could alter not only the development of the mind, but the function of the mind. So it creates great risk and great danger. And then in terms of this current political system, what we see is that while this sort of political theater, this dance is taking place, it's almost like watching WWE, professional wrestling. You see this loud and orchestrated dance taking place between two supposed opponents, these two parties in the ring. But what you don't see is the man behind the scenes quietly orchestrating the event. And that person is the one holding the power, of course. And the analogy might seem extreme at first, but it's really quite valid because the idea that there's two warring parties can be such a distraction. It's almost like watching a game of football or professional sports, and that takes their attention away from what's really going on, which is the preservation of this immense inequality and wealth created by these elites who are increasingly technocratic oligarch elites. It's really the umbrella under which this plutocracy functions. And it's not a coincidence that the likes of Zuckerberg and Musk and Thiel and so forth, Bezos, that their wealth has proliferated. It's become so extraordinary compared to the average American. And this chasm and wealth inequality that we see also in corporate America is drawn together the government to be almost like a corporate entity. It's like a Wall Street government. And there are these are real valid analogies, actually, because in a similar way where you see a sort of supposed victory between one party or the other, the Democrats or the Republicans, we see a similar celebration on Wall Street. At the close of the market every day, we see the ringing of the bell, and everyone standing there rings the bell, and they all clap and smile and celebrate. And the reason for that is because win, lose, or draw for the investing public, the brokers and the machinery behind Wall Street always profits. And in like fashion, it's the same thing with politics. No matter who ultimately occupies the office of the president, those elites who are in control, the inner circle, if you will profit regardless, because these are just really front men. Whether it's Harris or whether it's Trump. Harris, of course, is fond of saying that she grew up in a middle-class family. She repeats this almost like a mantra, no pun intended, given her Indian descent. But the reality is she owns 3 homes. She's worth about $10 million, I believe. She lives in the same neighborhood as LeBron James. So she is certainly an elite, and it's almost certain that her wealth will increase exponentially should she win the election. And when you look at what's really going on in terms of the billionaires who have sort of thrown their hat in the ring, you've got Mark Cuban sort of putting his weight behind the Harris ticket, and then you have Elon Musk throwing his hat into the ring behind Trump as the leading contender. And maybe we can say in a way that the Democratic Party has become sort of the party of fear, perhaps, and that the Republican Party has become the party of greed. Maybe people see it in these simple terms, but in reality, it's two sides of the same coin, and it's the interplay between these two emotions, these human emotions of fear and greed, that we also see in Wall Street, where people will make mistakes. They'll be buying something they shouldn't be buying or selling something they shouldn't be selling. And now we have truly not only a Wall Street government, but we could say that we have a government-run Wall Street where you can see these prominent figures, whether it's Cuban or Musk or Trump even, with DJT Enterprises and Musk with Tesla and SpaceX and Neuralink and these other entities. Tesla, I think the other day it added 20% or something like that in one day. It was to the tune of $100 billion. I think it appreciated in value that issue. And not driven by underlying fundamentals so much as it was driven by his public persona as now a political figure. And we see the same thing with DJT Enterprises, the company that's really almost no real assets, no remarkable technology that I can see, almost an immaterial customer base or client base, very limited participation, but it rises and falls based on the sort of how the forces in Wall Street and the investing public handicap Trump's prospects at winning the election. So we could say we've entered the era not only of the meme stock, but we've now progressed to the era of the politicized common equity. And so if you needed any more evidence that this is truly a plutocracy within the context of a technocrat oligarchy, that's it. But whether it's Harris or Trump, there's another member of these elites, this inner circle, who is ascending very, very quickly, and that is a dark figure. And that person is a product of a culture and a society where it's widely known, even the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has documented this, that adolescents suffer from great psychological maladjustment, from extremes of violence and crime in that culture. And so this individual has arisen, in his own words, as a sort of dark figure. And when we look at what the goals of that person, how he's sort of being positioned within this party elites, you might say, well, there is this exclusion in the Constitution for natural-born citizens in the United States to occupy the office of presidency. But I think that could be overcome, and we're already seeing a movement in the United States to get rid of the natural-born citizen requirement. And we see now this figure, this dark figure, sort of taking on that role and political ascendancy. He's meeting with world leaders like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and I don't think it's because these guys just want to buy a car from him. I think it's because they understand what's going on in Western elite circles and notion and aspiration maybe to have a global government, and that would start most likely with the United States and Europe. I'm not saying China signs on. Certainly they probably wouldn't, and neither would India or Russia, but we already see the emergence of the United Nations as sort of proto-form of a global government. And then you see these sort of non-democratic institutions in Europe with the central bank and so forth, and NATO, that are almost quasi-government agencies, but not democratic. And so it's not really a huge intellectual leap to think that, who's the natural heir to this office, and why is he being queued up behind an aging Trump, for example? And where does that really lead? And if you think it was bad that Harris did not exactly follow a democratic process to the White House, should she win this election, even if it's even a valid election, and skipping the primaries is going to be nothing compared to how other people might ascend to a position of great power within the emerging America that we see, and the role it will ultimately play in global politics. So we have to take a really hard look at that and say, what is going on in American politics? I mean, does democracy even exist as anything more than a mirage? Is it more than an illusion? Is it any more valid than watching professional wrestling? And what's really going on with these inner circles, this group of elites who are becoming incredibly wealthy, and they're getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. And they could not get that wealthy, frankly, without political support. I think for the average person, they're sort of sold this mythology this narrative that if you just worked really, really hard and you had the right vision and you did all the right things and you were a great entrepreneur, that you would ascend to that level of wealth. But actually, you cannot get to that level of wealth without a couple things. One, compromising yourself. And two, tremendous government support. That means support from the taxpayer. It's been said before, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And these groups, these elite circles, they are comprised of people willing to make compromises. And when one ascends as a charismatic leader, they really have a couple psychological personality traits in common. And one of them is the willingness of their followers to make compromises to get into that inner circle. They're willing to do things that are not even in their own best interest, much less the best interest of the population, to stay in that position of power because they're trading in their loyalty for influence. And just like there's a trade between greed and fear that results in a nonstop flow of profits for the controlling party, once this group of elites becomes more and more in power, the population is controlled more and more in their ability to have archival memory, to even question their own memory, to question their own knowledge of the facts. It's not a coincidence that we live in an era where overwhelmingly the population questions everything they know, such that they begin to question if there can even be a truth. Can there be a transcendent truth? Can there be a truth that is a unifying principle, a singular principle? That notion is so obfuscated in their mind, and by design, that they tend not to look at what is really going on. And so that is the erosion of democratic ideals. That is the erosion of the participation of the population in the decisions that might affect the outcome of their life, their prosperity. And so if you see a population becoming poor, but you see ascendant wealth, if you see the creation of the hyper-wealthy, if you see the creation of enormous wealth that is almost unprecedented in history, it's because it's by design. It's not really by coincidence. It wasn't that we suddenly gave rise to an individual or a person who simply was a better entrepreneur than the guy that came before him. And that's the fruit of the time we live in. But I would say, don't be afraid, because if the question is, how do we get out of this? If the question is, what is the way out? He has said, Christ has said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And that is the way forward. That is the way out of this. To come to believe that these digital chains, which encumber us, which take away our freedom, which erode our livelihood, that they are permanent, is an illusion. It's really within our hands to break free of them, but it requires faith, and it requires a pulling away from the image and likeness that these elites would have the population formed in. They want the population formed in their own image and likeness. It's not unlike a cult. In fact, the psychological characteristics of some of these ascendant personality types within American politics meet virtually every aspect of how you would traditionally define a cult leader. If you fall prey to that, if you fall prey to a charismatic leader, if you fall prey to someone because they are coercive or they manipulate through technology, I mean, you can have an abusive cult, and that can be done through technology. You can have a doomsday cult where you're led to believe that without the leader, that humanity might become extinct, and that it's only through them that humanity will be saved. And then you can have the politically occult leader who certainly is emerging. You see this figure in stadiums with 100,000 people roaring. That's covering pretty much all the bases of the type of cult leader you can get. And that takes away, of course, the attention from where it really belongs. The human mind should be directed towards Christ our Lord, not to this. And this will end very, very badly. It's been seen before. It's not been exactly seen in this manifestation because of the power of AI and social media and the confluence of those two things and the extraordinary control it has exerted over the human intellect. But qualitatively, the misinformation, the propaganda, the manipulation, the control is absolutely no different. And there is a way out, and that way is Christ.